Good evening, everyone. It's now 7 o'clock, so I'd like to start the first meeting of the Standards Committee. I'd like to remind everyone present this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Council's website. Could I remind members also, if they've got mobile phones, if they could turn them off or put them onto silent, please. We have some co-opted members, but I don't believe they're actually present for this meeting, Chair. That's right, yeah. Okay. Right, item 1, apologies for absence. I've received apologies from Councillors Allen and Shinnock this evening, and I believe, is there apologies from Jasdip, one of our co-opted members? Are there any further apologies? No. Okay. Item 2, urgent items of business. I've not agreed to any urgent items of business. Item 3, declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations of interest to declare? No. Okay. Item 4, terms of reference. Members are asked to note this committee's terms of reference set out on pages 5 and 6 of the agenda. Do members have any comments or questions on this item, please?
Not me.
Yeah, okay. Councillor Arnold.
Sorry. At 1.7, maintaining oversight of the council's arrangements for dealing with complaints. I kind of think that there might be something as a piece of work for us to do to sort of kind of review that, because I don't kind of see if there's an action towards a complaint, whether there's follow-up to make sure that action's happened, the timescale, things like that. I kind of felt like it needed a little bit more fluff and filling to give it substance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Mr. Fennick, like.
Thanks for the question. One would hope, or the aim, certainly of the next report, which is about the ethical framework, would provide you with that information about how complaints have been handled, say, for example, in terms of timeliness and other issues as part of that oversight. And I probably recommend that we look at what you would like in that report as the way forward, rather than necessarily changing the terms of reference and tying it down, because then it can be more flexible on all sides.
Councillor Herring.
Thank you. With the terms of reference, it looks like a lot of it is to do with very specific kind of complaints and things like that. I just wonder if there's any way that we can sort of make sure we look at the sort of cultural aspect of the council as well, because that's something which is, we always talk about the finances and stuff, but one of the big things in the reports has been the culture of the council, and it's quite hard to quantify culture and whether someone's acted in a way that's contrary to the culture we're trying to build. But I wonder if that's one of the things for this committee to look at, how we can enforce the changes we're trying to make in culture to the organisation.
Again, another good question. One would hope that if you look at the purpose of 1.1 is to try and address certainly something that would include the culture. That's and the high standards being the Nolan principles, which are in many ways are broad and cultural, and again looking at the items that are being brought to the committee. The purpose of the framework again is to try and for us to identify issues that we may think are say something good or bad or otherwise about the culture, but equally I'm quite happy for members to identify areas where they would want further information. And I think another aspect of that would be what I would certainly look to bring to this committee would be those parts of the Constitution that link to the ethical health of the authority. So, for example, the Member Officer Protocol, which would certainly address. And the purposes of the protocol are less to provide a set of rules than the guidance and practical guidance for members and officers about how to work with each other. And again, you could look at, well, is that working in practice? What's your experience, and bring that to it, rather than, and certainly my aim is that it isn't a dry document, and it is aimed at providing case studies and scenarios which members can learn from. And I think the third thing would obviously be around training. And it's certainly helpful to me for members of this committee and others to identify areas where training is needed, and that again could address those issues of culture. And I think, and one of the things I'm certainly thinking around is, you've got the code of conduct. We all know it's hampered by the fact there aren't any sanctions attached to it. But also it's quite specific in its provisions. And one of the things that the LGA has put forward, which I think I would like to suggest we promote, is around a culture of civility towards each other, which is not just how we have to behave, but how we choose to behave towards each other. Happy as part of this agenda and as we go through the year to start picking up those issues as well, and how it's really helpful to me that you've got a committee of members that are sort of actively discussing and supporting the ways forward, because I think it is quite influential towards other members.
Can I ask one more thing, please, Chair? Really enjoyed listening to your answer there, Dan, and also obviously a lot of this is based around individual members, as in there's been a complaint against this member or that member. But how do we sort of look at the culture of groups or cohorts of members? And I don't mean, political groupings like this group. I mean, sort of certain groups with maybe certain groups of members within. It could be even groups of members who cross party lines as well. Just when you get sometimes group culture that can be looked at, and it's again, I know I'm being quite woolly here because it's quite hard to quantify and define, but I wonder if that's something we should keep an eye out for as well.
I think that's right. Again, I'm going to be woolly back. No, I'll give you an example in Liverpool that we had was, and this may not be what you mean, but I think it's possibly sort of something you can work at, is you had a full council of 90 members, but you'd have 3-hour-long meetings, and you'd probably heard from 5 of them. So we made an active effort with the Lord Mayor there to try and actively promote diversity of voices. And our success in a couple of meetings by promoting that, and what we also probably know, you can probably guess, of those 5 voices that you would hear, maybe in 6, they were all men, and they were all long-established members, and I think quite a lot of members felt, particularly younger female members or new members, felt like, well, if I put my hand up, I'll also get shouted down or get booed. And that was one of those things where we did get to a meeting where we actually counted it up, or the Lord Mayor counted it up at the end, they had 35 members speaking, mainly because he stopped half of them speaking. But, and is it that kind of thing where you kind of, and some of it's unconscious?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of encouraging all members to feel like they can participate, and stop in sort of small groups, sort of bringing the culture into disrepute, like you said, certain small groups within groups who kind of do that, and that example you illustrated from Liverpool is kind of where I'm heading with it really, because if you're starting out as a councillor and the atmosphere is such that you feel you can't make the points you want to make, that you're elected to make on behalf of the people who sent you there, that's when the culture goes awry.
I would agree, and certainly, they had more of a culture of political debate in the full council meetings. Is you want to have those different views and different perspectives that you'll get from different age groups, different, experience, rather than it, I think, also trying to take it away from the, party political spat, which, as you know, you could probably predict what one person was going to say, what the other person was going to say in response. And I think genuinely towards the end. It was my ultimate compliment at Liverpool was somebody said, "Oh, council meetings are so boring now," because basically nobody was being chucked out. But there's that. I think. I mean, I certainly can look at that, and I think identifying what those issues are, and particularly working. Some of it may be working with members to build their confidence to say, to speak and bring that. I mean, obviously we're getting tied up on that, but it can be in other areas as well. I mean, I think from my perspective, it would link to that culture of civility. That, I mean, you've got a real balance here because you actually have a remarkably high threshold around what people can say, which would categorise as political expression. And you've got an example in a case study in the ethical update report here about somebody whose conviction was quashed because it was said to be political expression, and basically you're basically supposed to take it and have a thick skin. However, is that how we want to behave? And does it have that adverse effect that you're talking about of saying, well, and the number of members who have said to me over the years, why would I stand up and speak if that, all you're going to get is abuse or whatever? So I think that's one of those issues of, being able to criticise the policy, the stance, the decision, but not the person, I think is one of those ways forward. And I think would without taking out the necessary challenge and robust challenge and checks and balances, but it should be possible to do. Sorry, we're kind of, if that helps.
Thank you. Councillor Arnold, do you have another question that you'd like to raise? Yeah. Or to expand on your first question? Okay,
Part
that's
of the
fine.
question will be with that.
Yep,
so.
no problem. Okay, so I think we've we've seemed to has everyone said what they wanted to say on the on item 4? I think the big thing come out of that discussion was the fact that I think we need to know how we could do some work on the culture of the authority through the standards committee. If that could be somehow sorted, please. Okay, we okay to move on to item 5, guys? Oh, I'd like to welcome Charles to the meeting. Sorry, welcome to our first meeting. Is there anything you'd like to say on item 4? No? Okay, thank you. Right, we're on to item 5 now. Item 5 is terms of reference. Is this the...
Item 5, this one.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. It's ethical framework. I read the wrong bit. Sorry. As Appendix 3 to this report is exempt, if members wish to discuss the appendix, we'd need to go to an exempt session. So do we want to go into exempt straight away, or do we want to have some advice on whether we go into exempt straight away, or do we get you to present the report first?
I'd propose we discuss as much as we can in public, and then if there are any questions on that appendix, we can pick them up, would be my suggestion.
Okay, that's fine.
So,
take us through.
So just to present this, as I was indicating earlier, what we're looking to do here is to kind of report to the committee what you might sort of measures about the ethical health of the authority, and this will build up over time as you receive reports each cycle around key indicators such as training, gifts and hospitality declared, any declarations of interest made at meetings, but also, as we'll potentially talk about in exempt session, about the current cases or cases dealt with in the reporting period and what they say, and obviously it's open to the committee to comment on that. We also try and pick up any developments over the reporting period in the wider world of ethics and standards. I think specific issues, so we talk, I mean, I think if we're looking at things like culture and civility, we'd bring that separately under separate reports. But this information is obviously what I gather as monitoring officer with support from people in democratic services over the months, and sometimes when you pull it together, it becomes more informative as one. Sometimes with the, for example, with gifts and hospitality and declarations of interest, you kind of want to have not too many, not too few. If there are no declarations, then I think something's going wrong, because it's a normal thing to do if members to have declarations of interest, and so we might look at that. Less so, gifts and hospitality is it can be rarer, and as you'll see in terms of the reporting. But if we went through a period of a couple of cycles and there weren't any declarations, then we may look at, well, should we be reminding members of their obligations or providing extra information to promote that? And as I say, and you know, what we're looking at in terms of complaints is just to give you a sense of the volume of complaints. So I'll give you I'm sure you've had a number, but when I went into Liverpool, on my first meeting we had 44 live complaints. So that said a number of things. One, there was a number of conduct issues, but two, it also said something about how they were handling complaints, because some of those complaints were 2 years old, and that clearly wasn't acceptable. So you know, it's that, and some of that is actually when you talk about the terms of reference about oversight of complaints. That would be, if I was sitting on a standards committee, I'd immediately want to know, you know, well, what are we doing here, basically? It's not good for the complainant, it's not good for the subject member, and it's certainly not good for the ethical health of the council or its reputation. So we are not in that position, as you'll see from the appendix. The reason why it is exempt is because a number of those complaints aren't upheld, and therefore there's both personal data, but also, you know, in terms of the member complained about, the balance of public interest is usually in favour of maintaining that confidentiality. So in terms of, you know, not then getting vilified or publicity about something that was not upheld. And obviously there are different views on that, but that tends to be where we come from. So in terms of this, as I say, you know, there are, the critical thing will be the appendices, which set out where we are in the reporting period, and we're still the gifts and hospitality declared there is still from 2023, so we need to update that. In terms of declarations of interest, again, because we haven't had many meetings since May, we don't have any further declarations there, and any ones we've missed we'll report back. And obviously Appendix 3 is around exempt information. I would also point out there's some information given about a recent case which at 2.1.8 on page 10 through to the following page is making that point about the protection that we all have under the European Convention on Human Rights, which is incorporated into British law by the Human Rights Act, around the protection of freedom of expression. In this case, somebody who was convicted in respect of comments and statements about a town councillor then had that quashed on appeal because of the additional protection of that there needs to be, which is, I think we can all see the logic of it, around not censoring comments about our elected representatives, but it does create a bit of a dilemma, certainly in my view, about how do we balance that with the increasingly common issue of abuse of councillors, abuse of elected officials, and the general state of you know, the levels of intimidation in our politics. And so that's one, I would say, highlights one of the major issues we have. And I think when we look at Appendix 3, we can see some of that in some of the complaints we've had. And I think that discussion we've had around culture is a really important one. And hopefully, you know, in terms of the if we are able collectively to agree and set standards for ourselves, then hopefully it'll improve the quality of that debate. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have questions? We do. Do we need to go into exempt session for the questions?
Unless Councillor Kerrin's question.
It's not related to
No, I'd carry on.
No. Yeah, I was really interested in reading the Thomas Casserly case. Going back to what we discussed in the last item around enforcing culture, would this case make it nigh on impossible to enforce culture as opposed, obviously individual member wrongdoing can always be enforced and always has done, you know, but in terms of, we were talking about culture and how we can change it, but ultimately this case held the freedom of expression and the right to hold, you know, how you express your opinion are rights. So that would make it impossible, wouldn't it, to talk about what the change of culture we were talking about earlier?
Sort of, I suppose, classic lawyer's answer, yes and no. Yeah, the reason I suppose, to some extent, not to, this was a criminal case. So, of course, the burden of proof there is beyond reasonable doubt. So there is a much higher standard to achieve. I mean, and I think quite a few people feel nervous about people being subjected to criminal convictions around political statements for obvious reasons. But the main point about that burden of proof and standard of proof is quite an important one here. But yes, I think it is, I mean, that's the dilemma I'm speaking of. So I think the issue here would be around our developing a culture which does not accept that as a standard of debate. So again, you could say, for example, in committee or council meetings, there's the concept in Parliament of unparliamentary language, that you'd never accuse somebody of being a liar. And some, you know, those are statements that in other forums would be protected by political expression. So and obviously Parliament is Parliament, as opposed to a local council. But I certainly think that is a direction we could look at going in. And I think, as I say, you know, what the question I'd always try and pose and think about myself is, what do our residents expect? You know, from our conduct, do they expect to see a slanging match, or do they expect to see debates about the issues that are facing them? And I think that,
depending on the reason why they elected certain individuals, they might want that kind of sort of feisty slanging match, because that might be the nature of the politics at the time that meant, you know, elections went the way they did. You know, and in a way, we'd almost be arguing now about whether it's what someone says or how they say it. You know, it's not what you said; it's how you said it. You know, it's making it. We were talking that we used the expression "woolly" earlier, and I think it's probably based on this and our discussion. It's probably going to continue being woolly in that sense, because, you know, one person's robust discussion is another person's cause and offence. Yeah, and it's how do we navigate through that?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things that, I mean, you all will be aware is you may be you may succeed by being elected by part of the electorate, a majority more than anybody else, but you represent the whole community. So there is an important message around you have, to all councillors, and the same for officers, you know, we have to act on behalf of the whole community, and they may have different views about, you know, go in and sort them out or whatever that view is. So, but it's definitely a challenge, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And for me, you know, I suppose it's, you know, it's that substantive point about, I think it's perfectly possible. I mean, planning committee is the classic example where you get really, you know, high emotions because it's affecting people's, you know, homes, properties, livelihoods. The how you express that is really important. And I think another thing is, how do you accept if a decision goes against you, and using the appropriate routes for challenging that, because there always are. But I think also, to be fair, I mean, one of my observations about coming to Thurrock is you have quite a long legacy of how people have felt excluded and frustrated from the mechanisms of the council and being able to contribute. And if we tackle that, then we may be able to have a more sustained quality of debate. And so it isn't, I think it would be wrong to see conduct in isolation. Obviously, we need to improve our conduct, but if you see it in the I would say councillors of all sides have said to me is, we need to change that, the openness of the council to receive different points of view. But when a decision is made, all parties then need to accept that as a decision. And obviously it's for the voters at the ballot box to decide, who's right and who's wrong, I suppose. And, we've got all out elections next year, so, we'll find out then, if that makes sense. But, I think understanding the subtleties of the debate is actually really important.
Yeah.
Councillor Johnson, do you want to go into exempt session for your
No,
question?
it's not on the big one yet. It's around the general declaration of interest. I've always found it difficult because it's a pecuniary interest, which is, has to be said. There's no two ways about that. But, you can sit in meetings and it goes on forever, people declaring interest, which, I look on one here about in housing with a councillor who is in their ward has got an interest in a particular development. Well, if they didn't have, they shouldn't be councillors. I mean, but as a lawyer, do you recommend that people do say everything, or because I do think it's around the pecuniary interest. I really do.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose to answer that, I think one, that is, what we declare or what are the interests we want to declare is something within the remit of this committee to then recommend on to full council. I'm quite happy to have a review of that. I think you're absolutely right. There are some core issues that relate to, does this affect the financial or other pecuniary interests of yourself and your spouse? There is, and that's where you live, what your job is, who your employer is, all those things that I think people are kind of like the primary interests, and actually most interests are covered by that. I'm, how far we go beyond that, because that's the statutory framework, is a decision for this council about where do you want to have the balance, and secondly, is it about transparency of simply declaring I'm a governor at this school, but as everybody knows, I do it voluntarily in my own time, so should that mean I shouldn't be able to participate? But you could have a different view, which is, well, if the council is determining whether or not to grant fund a school £500,000, then that's going to be different than if it's it just happens to be one of 50 schools mentioned in a report in relation to something that's non-pecuniary. Those are the subtleties. But I think a big word is proportionality. About what is the balance between, on one hand, your private interest and your public interest in representing your constituents. Because I'm a big advocate of, as you say, you well, I would hope every councillor on this council has strong opinions and views on many things. That's why you're here. So we try to enable that as much as possible. So I think there is a discussion about that. I think there is a nervousness sometimes, and I can certainly read things here. Let's have a look at Corporate Parenting Committee. I mean, it's not picking on anybody in particular, but it says Councillor Carter declared an interest in a relative assisted with Christmas care leavers dinner. Didn't need to declare that. Okay, I mean, we will note that there's a statutory provision that if somebody declares something, we have to record it. I think there needs to be clear advice as to what is that. What is the category of that? Is somebody just doing it because they want people to know, or is it being put forward because it's a requirement to do that here? And part of looking at this is exactly those questions, is say, well, where have we strayed too far one way or the other, and do we need to have clarity here? So I certainly look at those and think I'll be talking to Dem services about and lawyers at committees to give a bit more robust advice to say, let people know, but we're not going to record it as an interest, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Dan,
Charles.
so you just take your mic off.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, the camera will go to Charles then.
Thank you. I've got a few questions, but can I just start off by asking, on the gifts and hospitality, an amount of £50 has been set.
Yeah.
Is that something that was set by local government or the council agreed that?
That figure is set by each council. I would say, I mean, the original figure, which was set in the Code of Conduct, was introduced by legislation in about 2001-2, was £25. So I think that's just showing a bit of inflation at £50, but it's set by this council, and obviously, again, I would say on recommendation from this committee about what is the balance between something that I think has some meaningfulness in terms of would it influence somebody's decision making, and that's the purpose of the reason for declaring gifts and hospitality.
Still on gifts and hospitality, there's quite a few things on between 2.8 and 2.14 that, in my mind, I'm probably not sure where this is going. Broadly speaking, there's a £50 limit that everything above that has to be declared. So I'm asking myself and just thinking out loud, who's setting the limit for £50? Is this the valuation based on who the person who's received it, or is it a standard set valuation? Sorry. That's fine. It was just the case of that £50 limit. Is that based on your valuation as the person receiving the gift? If you're giving a gift and whatever value you put to it, that's what you record. Number one. Number two, there's also a requirement to declare gifts not taken up, i.e. refused or declined. Does that then make it null and void, that £50 limit? Because whether you take it or you don't take it, you're going to have to declare it. So is it just then a case of, is the £50 relevant?
I think, as I said before, the £50 is, what we're looking for is a reasonable amount that would, below which, it may be relatively insignificant. So somebody could buy you, for example, a tea and coffee. You go to a charity event and somebody buys you a cup of coffee. Should you be declaring that? I think quite a lot of councils have £25 still as the limit, and view that anything above that is like somebody taking you out for a meal in the evening. Is that something, so sometimes you look at what is it likely to be able to buy you, and what would be reasonable, or in terms of a gift, so I don't know if members have this experience, but a grateful constituent may bring a box of chocolates or something like that. And in terms of value is useful. It just gives you a benchmark, but inherently there's an arbitrary element to that. But I wouldn't say Thurrock is particularly far out on that. I've inherited that figure, so I've come from a place where it's £25. I've seen places where it's £100, and I would say that's way too high. In terms of what would the public perception of, well, somebody can have be taken out for dinner and it's £80, estimated at £80. That's that could influence their decision making. In terms of how do you calculate that, all we would ask for is a reasonable estimate. So. And sometimes it's very difficult. If you take, if you get hospitality and it's a buffet, at a, we're not expecting people to say, well, what that sandwich would be. But equally, what I've had in a previous authority is everybody would say above £25 if the limit was £25. And I think, particularly for meals out, and it wouldn't take too much to just check if you were taken to a particular restaurant, what's the, likely cost of that. So if it's, Le Gavroche or whatever, you're going to be lucky if you get a starter for £25. Whereas other places, it may not be the case. So, I think I would expect people to be sensible about it. I think if we received a declaration of gifts or hospitality that was clearly inaccurate, I think I would expect the team to go back and check what that was. It is very often hard on gifts. So often you may get gifts if you get a visiting councillors from another country, they may bring a gift, and it's impossible to work out what that is. But really what we're looking for is there evidence that a donor is seeking to influence a councillor or more than one councillor through gifts and hospitality? And I can assure you that, in other councils, I've certainly seen clear evidence that that was the case. The classic is a day at the races, or, foreign trips, those kind of things. And what I would expect councillors to be doing if they did, it's only about declaring it, but then the second thing would be to say if you're on planning committee and you declared gifts and hospitality, and it so turned out that 2 months later the person who was donated, took you on a trip or whatever, had a planning application in front of your planning committee, that may be a situation where you say, actually, those two things don't go together. So a planning committee at one of the councils I once worked at all received hampers every Christmas. Now, fortunately, they all declared it and we sent them all back. But, it is not unknown for these things to happen, and we're just trying to regulate and be transparent about it. I don't see any particular evidence in Thurrock as yet of, shall we say, abuse of that. Or I think it's really important that, it sounds like we're getting at councillors. Actually, the target is probably the donors, and just say that's not how we work in the public sector. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. It does. One further point: there's not a requirement to register gifts and hospitality which do not relate to your role as a councillor. That, to me, seems to be a grey area, to the extent that you could have had people in your constituency who are local football club members, who are part of a planning application of some sort, giving you gifts and hospitality. And it then begs the question, in what capacity did I receive this? And when you have to make that judgment, there's always that point where you could say, I would put it wherever suits me best. Is that something that maybe could be done differently? Especially probably my focus would be gifts and hospitality to family members, which are not recorded.
Yeah, so I think to some extent that final point is right. It isn't an obligation under the Code of Conduct. However, if we're going to be really serious about it, it could be evidence of bribery and corruption. So it may be that it would be looked at that way. If in essence a gift to a family member was a proxy gift to a councillor, then we would have concern. And again, in previous authorities, dealt with those kind of situations. I think the point would be if any councillor was, and as I say, 95+% of councillors I've come across have not found themselves in this situation, or have been totally alive to an attempt to improperly give them gifts or hospitality. But in where there was a grey area, I think I'd encourage members to seek advice. And I think one of the, probably going back to that culture point, is I don't think enough guidance and practical examples are given about how to deal with situations here, and what to do. I think what we're trying to get at about the private interest is what is the link to you? Is the gift linked to your capacity as a councillor, even if it isn't directly when you're acting as a councillor? But we are also looking to exclude things like birthday presents and and those kind of things. And I know a long time ago a councillor asked me about they were getting married and received a gift from somebody and that yes they had come across them when they were a councillor, but actually they were a personal friend, and we wouldn't want I think that's going too far, basically.
Okay, any more questions?
It was just to follow up on that point. Would there then be a recommendation to provide clearer guidance as to the necessity to probably not, maybe not accept, but not, should I say, probably better to say, would there be a requirement for councillors to highlight or to bring to light gifts to family members that are seen as, or would that not be part of the code and it's simply just out of it?
To some extent, it's up to the council what it decides to do. I think there is a privacy aspect to this and what's a proportionate response. But I would probably hope, and we can, again, in issuing guidance, if a councillor found themselves in a situation whereby a family member, son, daughter, father, whatever, suddenly started receiving gifts and hospitality from somebody who we knew was going to put in a planning application, I would expect any member would go, hang on, there's something fishy here. I'll take that to the monitoring officer. So I would hope that, and we can provide answers around that. But I think we've got to get the balance right in terms of not too much invasion of councillors' privacy. And I think, to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of things are direct, fairly unsubtle attempts to influence councillors, because in the private sector, companies may have their own internal code of conduct, but there aren't statutory regimes to prevent what you might call gifts and hospitality that is out of or not allowed in the public sector, and understanding that cultural difference can often be quite difficult for the private sector. So.
Thank you. Is there any other questions on this item at all? Exempt. Should we go into exempt now? Right, can we? Yep, we're going to go into exempt session for another question. Oh. Okay, right, so we're back in public session. Just want to go through some points that come out from our questions, which was the report needs to be updated in that the current status of any complaints is put down in the report, whether it's sort of what the action, what has happened, if there's been an action, or if there has been no action has been taken by the monitoring officer. Also to check whether the action that the monitoring officer decided has been, if it's training to a particular councillor, if that has been taken up. Maybe looking at more information and maybe maybe making sure, and maybe it's whether we understand the terminology, the words that are being used, or whether we need different words being used so we can understand exactly more of the nature of that complaint, because sometimes, like you say, some of these words different people would understand it in a different way. Timescale of complaints, and also sort of think maybe do we need to ensure that members are aware of how if they feel they need to make a complaint, that they know what they need to do, so they don't end up just sort of, I don't know if there is a case of people be emailing rather than if there is a set form that needs to be completed to make it official, so that it gets to the monitoring officer for him to decide whether it needs to be taken further or not. Do we need to make members aware that is what we need to do if we feel we have to make a complaint? A complaint needs to be made about, or even just members of the public, whatever. Is that have I got that right on what we've discussed? Yeah. Right, I think Councillor Kerrin was first and then Councillor Arnold.
It's even things of knowing, where the alleged, was it something that was said once in a meeting, or was it a series of statements on social media, or, like where the nature of these complaints originated from, just more context, whilst also protecting the privacy and dignity of the accused, but actually knowing, you know, one-off statement in a committee or a series of inbox messages on Facebook. You know, it all has different context, doesn't it? So just being aware of that as well.
Thank you. Councillor Arnold?
Thank you. Dan mentioned about a protocol for him and officers around the stages and how it's going to be dealt with, and I think that's important for us to understand as well.
Yeah, sorry. So how would we, with that protocol that Councillor Arnold mentioned, could you give us some sort of advice on how we would start to...
So what I think as part of your terms of reference is to have oversight of the code of conduct hearing, the code of conduct itself, and also the what we'd say the complaints process, and then attached to that would be the kind of protocol about, you know, performance standards if need be, openness, etc. What I would suggest is that we bring all of those documents to you, because I think throughout the course of the meeting we've talked about what should be in the code of conduct, what should we have to declare, and I think the process could probably do with a review, and that's with a view to then that going on to committee and full council as part of the constitution review, because I think for me simplicity is everything, because I think the standards are relatively clear what we're looking to achieve, and a really convoluted process can then end up losing, taking a long time and losing the essence of what we're trying to achieve as well. So we'll look at the work plan outside of this and where we can fit that in, and produce you know, some suggestions to you, and then have a debate at committee.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any other comments members have on this item? We've got, believe we have some recommendations which are on page 8 of the agenda. Do you want me to read them out?
Yes, please.
Right, okay. Recommendations. For reasons set out in the report, the Standards Committee is asked to 1.1 note the list of gifts and hospitalities declared for the period May 2023 to May 2024, and comment on the process for great transparency and accountability for gifts and hospitality set out in paragraph 2.6. Is that noted, members?
Noted.
Thank you. 1.2, note the declaration of interest made at meetings for the period May 2023 to 2024. Is that noted?
Noted.
And 1.3, note the update on the code of conduct complaints received.
Noted.
Sorry.
You say it, go on. You go for it. Yeah, I think you're going to say.
Do we need to expand 1.3 to cover everything that we've just said? Because we're not just noting.
Okay, I can put
Yes,
some words
can
together and then I can include that in the recommendation.
So we're noting, but we need to work to expand on the documents.
Yeah,
I don't know. Is that all right?
Yeah,
Can you
that's
do
fine.
that?
Yeah.
Sorry. Are you happy for the Dem Services to do that? Yeah. Okay. Right, we are now going to go on to 1.4. Is there 1.4?
Okay.
There isn't
I
1.4
didn't
on
see a
mine.
1.4.
There's no 1.4 on mine.
Oh,
Chair.
sorry, my
Yeah.
mistake. My
Yeah.
mistake.
Not unless there's a gremlin somewhere.
No, it's not, is there? Okay, must have copied that from somewhere else. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Right, we now move on to item 6, which is... Hang on, I can't find it now. Sorry. Right, page 21. Sensitive members' interest guidance notes. So is that okay to do this in open?
Yes,
meeting?
yeah, that's
Okay.
fine.
So can I ask Dan to take us through the report, please?
So this relates to a very specific aspect of the statutory regime and code, and reflects decisions taken in councils up and down the country, and you will note also reflects a letter from the Secretary of State, which is at page 27, around the question of when you you're under an obligation as councillors to declare and register your home addresses, as again, going back to that issue of pecuniary interest, and ordinarily, or the default position legally, is that they would be published on the council's website as part of your register of interests. There's a specific provision under the legislation, Section 32 of the Localism Act, which gives the power specifically to the monitoring officer of each council the right to withhold any of a councillor's declared interest as a sensitive interest where there's evidence of a risk of violence or intimidation towards that councillor. And this, just as background, this was brought in 2011 mainly in relation to particular threats around certain councillors who were working at Huntington Life Sciences, which was kind of related to animal welfare activists threatening and particular kind of threats, but there was no way of those councillors being able to not disclose that information. Also, serving police officers or former police officers, for example, or people involved in security services, rarely publish those addresses. But the specific issue we have at the moment is, we discussed earlier, the kind of rising tide of intimidation, whether online or in person or by other means, of elected officials, with obviously some very high-profile tragic cases involving Joe Cox and David Amis. And the mood has been towards, well, is there a general looking at, and from me as a monitoring officer, making a risk assessment about this? Well, is it appropriate that we take a stance that all members' home addresses, and where appropriate those of their partners, should be treated as a sensitive interest and withheld from public disclosure unless that member chooses to make them public? And I think the balance, for the reasons set out in the report, is in that direction. This is something we introduced in Liverpool, and we particularly had regard, and there are very similar issues of some quite serious individual cases. We also had a number of single parent families or women living on their own who felt vulnerable if their address was published, and obviously that wider context of real life cases of where, whilst the likelihood of something happening was still very low, the impact, if it did happen in those very extreme cases, was irreparable. So I've attached a kind of rationale for my decision making, which is that all home addresses should be maintained as a sensitive interest unless a member chooses to disclose. So it's putting that in the hands of the individual member, and I would probably advise, if anybody was going down that route, to take some advice, but also making it clear that whilst the home address would not be published, the obligation still to treat that as a pecuniary interest, disclosable pecuniary interest, still stands. But say in a planning committee is the obvious example, you would declare the interest but without identifying the property or the nature of the interest, and that would be accepted and minuted as such. Hopefully it's relatively straightforward. Hopefully it's agreed that that's the right approach, but I'm more than happy to take any questions. I would say in practice we've applied this as from May as well. And I think there's also just a little bit of guidance in there for members about, well, we can do what we can, but you just need to be really careful about where people will scrape the internet to find your home location, and even from location, leaving your location on or whatever. And there's some guidance in there. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I think it's just as sad that we've actually got to the stage where people that we have to go down this route, but the time we're living in, unfortunately. Councillor Kerrin.
So obviously home addresses are no longer on it. Was the same decision taken with workplaces as well? Just because you gave the example of the Huntington Life Sciences.
It can be. I think home addresses are obviously that much more personal. But we can, I mean, I think at the moment, and I've not been made aware of any. The difficulty for monitoring officers is that it says if there is evidence of, and so obviously what is that standard of evidence? And I think I'm prepared to take the risk with regard to home addresses. I'm quite happy to receive evidence if there is a general issue around work addresses, either on an individual or a group level, and happy to have that fed back to me.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any comments?
Charles?
Charles? Any comments on that? No. Okay, I think we've got some recommendations on page 21. So first one is 1.1. Agree the guidance notes of the monitoring officer in relation to the exclusion or disclosure of sensitive members' interests as set out in Appendix 2. Agreed? Yeah. Okay. 1.2. If agreed, the guidance note is published on the Council's website to strengthen transparency, and all members are written to by the monitoring officer to make them aware of the guidance. Agreed that we do that as well? Okay. And 1.3. Note the addition of the new member interest list in 2.3, of which the monitoring officer has reviewed and accepted. Noted?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we go on to item 7, which is the work plan. Now I know we've got an ad which is going to be added outside the meeting with the bits we discussed in item 5?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Has any members got any comments on the work plan, anything they'd like to add? And have we picked up, we're 100% sure we've picked up anything that would have been in the old Standards and Audit Committee report that related to standards?
Yeah,
There's
we have
nothing
had a
that's sort
look.
of like,
No,
you know.
we've had a look.
Done.
Yeah, done. Just,
Oh, hang on.
yes.
A question. I probably, this was in item 5 where there was, sorry, yeah, item 5 where there was an update on training done in May 2024, where 20 out of 49 members attended. And it was just an observation, is there a rolling training provided for other members to make sure all members were adequately informed or trained on various matters? Or was it just a case of whoever wants to attend?
There is, I don't know.
So it was a session open to all members because it followed the election. So we had a mix of new councillors, but also some returning councillors. But I think you do hit on a good point about how do we make members aware of their obligations, and there are a number of different ways of doing it, including formal training. And I think one of the issues we will be looking at as part of the constitutional review and the improvements that the council needs to make to its governance is to look particularly at developing towards a really effective members induction next year, when all of the council seats will be up for election, and it will be a choice for the council as to whether it makes, for example, training, at least one session of training on the code of conduct, a mandatory or discretionary piece of training to undertake. You know, I mean, I would obviously say it probably should be, but I think we need to also be able to provide that in a number of different media. So, and that is something that certainly needs development in this council.
Councillor Arnold.
Thank you, Chair. I think it should be added that some councillors, when they're not new councillors, they've already done the code of conduct training, and they may have done it several times. And this is where, for me, there needs to be a conversation about levels of training, because a new induction training doesn't necessarily fit with some of us that are a bit older in the tooth. But nevertheless, we need to be reminded, but should there be another level to attend another, or something said around who should be going and not going? Because I think there is that element, and rightly or wrongly, I perceive that there's an element of, well, I know this because I've been doing it a long time and I haven't had a complaint against me, and all of them sort of like excuses you can use. But sometimes you're sitting listening to something that you've already listened to.
Yeah, so I think when I was referring to a really effective members induction, it needs to address different needs. Although I would say, certainly our view at Liverpool, that some of the councillors who have been there 40 years probably needed the training more than others. but no, you're absolutely right. And some of it is about also specific training about specific issues as well. So, for example, member-officer relations and understanding what that is. I'm still finding my feet about what the culture is. I sort of have some times where I've got expectations that aren't met, and sometimes it's quite clear that, you know, I mean, for example, the audit committee last week, the standard of questions was excellent, and that slightly surprised me. So I've just got to find that. But I think there's it's a good moment in time when you're going into a 4-year administration to get things right. And obviously we'll be talking to members about what that needs to look like, and that'll be really helpful feedback. Last thing we want to do is drag you along to training. You think, I've heard all this before, and there's nothing new here.
Just so one more point, just on the work programme, is the other stuff that you're going to talk about outside the meeting, because our next meeting isn't until the 5th of November, and we like the fact that we have got historically a problem with the culture and stuff in this authority. We want to get the job done right, but we don't want it, or properly, but we don't want it to sort of go on and on. So do you have a rough idea when it could potentially be put into the work programme? I'm not going to hold you to it.
No, that's all right. I mean, I think the work programme you probably look at is fairly generic. There are certain things that would be standing items. We wanted to have a discussion with the committee about how do we put more substantive items in there. So I think what we'll look to do is, and we're quite happy to share it with members in between the meetings, of what that might look like over the year, because we also don't want to overburden you with some really heavy stuff in, you know, is spreading it out over the timetable. But I think if we start by looking at that core document, which is the code of conduct, how we handle complaints and related issues, and we can also bring some stuff round about the, as I say, this added concepts of civility and culture, and have a debate. And obviously, you know, we can do that in groups as well. It's not limited to this, you know, because we've got to engage with everybody on that.
Is there any other comments anyone would like to make? Councillor Arnold.
Just to say that, kind of beat me to it. I was going to say we could always look at it and see if we need a task group to look at it separately. Maybe.
Okay, so if no one's got anything else to say, I think we will be closing the meeting, and I don't know what the time is, sorry.
8:19.
8:19. Thank you everyone for attending. So,